As well, Brexit promises go, the idea that food was going to get cheaper wasn't necessarily right or wrong. It just depended on the direction of, shall we say, cheapness. Because I've talked about this before, and I really at some point need to do a video on it. And I need to track down the original article because the original article was really good. And I want to talk to the two historians that were in that. And I can't for life for me remember the names, but I know they're in the article. And I would love to sort of have a chat with them about it. But we've sort of been here before, you know. People forget that the Crystal Palace, the sort of the world's first World Fair, why that was built. It was built with this idea to promote the greatness and the enterprising sort of nature of Great Britain at the time. But that wasn't the real reason. The other reason behind it, the other reason that was being built to sort of foster this notion was the idea that we should go and join this Austrian economic idea of just having zero tariffs. We just say we ain't going to have tariffs at all. Now, what happened, ironically, was 5 years later, this was completely reversed. Why was it reversed? Well, this was because the farmers at the time were having huge struggles because they could not compete against the amount of cheap wheat, barley, you name it, sort of, sort of long-lasting agricultural goods that were coming in from America. They just could not compete against them. And so as a result, the original Brexit once again failed. And we're here again we are what, 4 years almost out, because obviously we Brexited in like 2020 properly. And we're 4 years out, and yet we're already having conversations about, well, Brexit's failed. We did obviously the Telegraph's quote apology for Brexit. But yeah, it's bizarre, and honestly, I've got to go back and sort of actually do that video, and sort of go and have a look at the sort of the research, because it's a very sort of interesting piece of political and economic sort of history that happened at the time. But I'll have to sort of try and track that down, and certainly if I can try and get one of those two historians that were involved in it, and the author of the article was sort of speaking to, that would be fantastic to sort of get done. But I'll have to try and track the article down first. But what we are once again talking about is food prices, because it looks like that, well, as Jacob Rees-Mogg said, but a year, 2 years ago now, I think it was, that we can't have these checks in, because if we do, food prices will go up, and we're in a cost of living crisis, can't really have that. And yet, this is what we are seeing now, that we are going to see food prices rise. We are still in a cost of living crisis. Not talked about that much, but it's still the case. Energy prices still very high. What do you think is going to be the consequences of this? And one interesting thing, if you know history, you know that big political upheavals and things like that very often predicated on the price of bread. And this is certainly one of the things we could see increase in price. So who knows if history will repeat itself with that? Hopefully not. But there you go. So before we do get into this, please do remember to click on the like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below there are links to my Patreon page, the one affiliation link called Buy Me Coffee Week. Well, Buy Me Coffee, the YouTube thank you button, and of course, as always, there is the Pony Club down below as well. And yes, I think that's everything. So yes, go check those out down below. And of course, as always, you can always click the like, the share, and of course, leave a comment for the algorithmical witchery and whatnot that goes on with the Google and YouTube algorithms. And of course, you can hit the subscribe if you are new to the channel. So let's crack on into this, coming from the BBC. The title of Food Price Fears as Brexit Import Charges Revealed. So the government has now revealed how much companies will now have to pay food imports from the EU due to Brexit. We've been talking about this before. We've talked about the dangers that this is going to sort of be. Delis, easily the biggest one of this. We've talked about how much they're going to sort of suffer for this. A number of different things and food items are going to be very, very much increased on this. So, small imports of products such as fish, salami, sausage, cheese, yogurt will now be subject to fees from up to £105.40 from April 30th. So, from May, potentially maybe already kicking in throughout April, who knows, you will probably see a rise in these food costs, and probably other foods that these are used in as well. So the Cold Chain Federation says that these new charges will now hit food prices. They said the government says that the fees that we would now pay for the world-class border facilities, of course, some of these world-class border facilities aren't even being used. One even in particular, the one in Portsmouth, probably having to be shut down. But there you go. The fee known as the common user charge will now apply to all animal products, plant products, all entering the UK from the EU through the port of Dover and Eurotunnel at Folkestone. It will be charged per good type on imported good. The commodity line and now capped at £145 for mixed consignments. Individual products will now face charges of £29. This will apply to all goods deemed low, medium, and high risk. And this is going to cause huge, huge costs. Even if you are doing just small assignments, adding on that extra £29, well, we might as well say 30 quid on top of that, on top of all the stuff you've got to pay, the cost of the paperwork, potentially the extra time, potentially the extra logistical cost that you now have to pay on top of that. It's going to be more than £30 for small individual products, which most small bean businesses are doing. I saw someone recently in the comments talk about how these types of companies, these small enterprises, are going to have to start clubbing together to sort of form a bigger united chain. And it wouldn't actually shock me if there were businesses now saying, right, we're just going to just specialize in importing like specialty products from Europe and then like being like the wholesale distributor to these smaller chains, but we're not based in Europe, we're based in sort of the UK. We do all the importing, they do all the buying for us. Would not shock me if there are things setting up like that. But even then, they're not going to be cheap, or at least as cheap as they used to be. So it's going to have a big impact, big impact on a lot of businesses. The Cold Chain Federation's chief executive, Phil Puck, said the fees would now have to be passed on either to the EU importer, the small UK retailer, or the UK customer. Ultimately, this increases costs for businesses and food prices potentially now lowers the choice for the shoppers, he said. He added that the government has now announced the charges very much at the last minute, leaving the all-affected businesses very little time to revise their commercial arrangements. Government doing something at the last minute to do with Brexit? Imagine my shock. Of course, it's the last minute. Of course, businesses love dealing with things like this at the last minute. Yeah, going to be lots of angry people in businesses for the next probably month or so. But the Horticultural Trades Association also said that the policy felt like it was constructed on the back of an envelope at best. Well, it probably was. It probably was. He said, you would undoubtedly now increase costs, potentially reduce customer choice, and increase the likelihood of empty shelves. Our sector is now typically multiple commodity lines per consignment, meaning in reality, our business sector will now be paying the £145 maximum charge, says James Bard, the HCA chairman. The horticultural consignments can include plants, seeds, bulbs, cut flowers, he said. And the government has now delayed implementing these charges over 5 times, partially to try and give businesses time to prepare to reduce disruption to the supply chains. The reason why it wasn't just disruption to supply chains, it was just because the border checks just weren't ready as well. They had all this time to prepare to have this stuff in place, and it was just not there. And yeah, oh, guess we'll just have to delay them. Guess we'll just have to delay them again. And five times. Five times. I was thinking we were going to hit six. I was really thinking we were going to hit six because you are going to see some severe border chaos. And, this is just the paperwork. Physical checks, I think, come in a bit more later, although they are implementing the physical checks a bit more slowly until they are sort of fully enforced, I think, in October late this year. But you are going to see a lot of chaos. And bear in mind, even though it's not in the news anymore, you still get those queues down in Kent. Those queues still very much there. They're just not in the news as much as often as they were. But it wouldn't surprise me if we saw more Q news while this sort of stuff came in. So the new border checks will now be phased in gradually over the next 12 months, but physical checks have now been flagged as starting the 30th of April after some time. However, the cost associated with these checks has not been revealed until now. Prior to Brexit, trade between the EU and the UK was now free-flowing and frictionless. Why did we give this up? Who knows? But following the UK's departure from that trading bloc, this has now changed as a result of the relatively distant approach to the EU relations adopted by the UK government. I'm glad they put that in, that it is the UK government's fault for this, not the EU's, or else we would be sort of heavily mentioning that. So, yeah, it is, as of course, as always, the UK government's fault, but there you go. Labour said that British shoppers and businesses were now rightly worried about the prices being driven up again, and they warned about the potential for chaos from these new border checks. The Shadow Minister, Nick Thomas, said that with little less than a month before the introduction, we now know what the cost will be. Labour has a plan to try and reduce this bureaucracy through now seeking to try and negotiate a veterinary agreement with the EU to try and massively reduce the need for checks, helping to make food cheaper and our businesses more competitive. In a statement, the government said that the flat rate charge was, quote, the bottom end of the range, which was consulted the industry on. I'm sure those industry consultations went very well. It said that this charge was, quote, designed to try and recover the cost of operating our world-class border facilities where essential biosecurity checks to protect our food and supply chains and environmental standards against costly disease and outbreaks entering the UK through the short straits. Well, we already know these checks aren't going to cut it. We already know that these checks aren't going to cut it. All it needs, and I've talked about this before, I do fear that we might get something big again, like foot and mouth, mad cow disease. And bear in mind, you've already got two potentially floating around. You've got swine flu, potentially, which would devastate the UK pork industry. And there is an avian flu as well, which, if that happened, would completely devastate the poultry industry here in the UK. So, no more chicken and eggs almost, or at least would be incredibly hard to come by. And of course, chicken in particular, a very, very big staple meat for a lot of people in the UK. So yeah, we'll have to see what happens with this, but oh no, another thing that we said was going to happen has happened. you know, shock horror. But this is it. Once again, we said if you do this, this is going to happen. How are you going to deal with this? Don't worry about it, they said. But there you go. Anyway, we'll see what happens, but obviously Labour sort of going for those sort of different separate negotiations. I can see that happening potentially. As I've said before, Switzerland, Norway, all these other countries that are have these very sort of different agreements, do these types of sort of side deals, as we say all the time. I really cannot see the EU maybe being a bit, we're not sure, but it's either you do that and you sort of, quote, help improve Brexit, and then you can go, well, look, this is Brexit, this is as best it's going to be, or you go back to the UK once again and say, well, look, Brexit's been a complete absolute disaster. Are you sure you really want to continue with this? And hey, eventually, as we always said, we would end back in the EU in some way, shape, or form. I think it's going to happen a lot quicker than I think most people would would sort of think, or at least predicted back at that time. You know, we had people saying, "Oh, it's going to be like 10 years once we Brexited before even people think about rejoining the EU." Could be even quicker than we suspect. But as always, thank you very much for watching. And of course, as always, we'll see you all next time.